Hi, welcome to the Leadership Bootcamp podcast. This is Jeff Strauss. On today's episode, I'm interviewing Steve Heckler. Steve is the author of the new book, You Want to Be a Manager. Steve is the former Senior Vice President and Chief Information Officer of Sony Pictures Entertainment and has held leadership positions at companies including Bank of America, IBM, and Activision. Steve is the past president of the Society for Information Management, the past president of the Professional Coaches and Mentors Association. He is a past executive board member of the Southern California chapter of the ACLU. And in this podcast episode, we discuss the importance of communication, hiring quality candidates, team well-being, how to create a mission and vision, advice for first-time managers, and other topics. I hope you enjoy the conversation as much as I did. And now I bring you Steve Heckler. Steve, thank you very much for joining me on the Leadership Bootcamp podcast. Really excited to have you here. I want to take a moment because we've already introduced you to the audience, but I want to take a moment and just share with you that I really enjoyed the book, So You Want to Be a Manager. I'll talk more about why I enjoyed the book, but I want to start off with, I thought it was a really interesting approach to a management book, very different from a lot of other books that are on the market today, particularly like the popular sort of consumer literature. So I just wanted to share with you that I really enjoyed it. I'm very happy to have you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for the kind words.
A pleasure. So I'll start with that question, which is the book is a departure from many of the management books out there today because unlike many of those books, your book doesn't dive into like one or two topics to a very, very deep level or sort of abstract those topics with a lot of anecdotes and stories that are sort of tangential to the topic, but not directly, like deeply related to the transfer of knowledge about that topic. Yours is more like a reference guide, and it touches on a dozen or more management competencies. And I think it provides entry points into learning more about that topic. If it went into depth into every single one of those topics, you'd have a 1,000-page book or volumes of books. So my question is, why did you choose this particular format for the book rather than going into one or two deep topics, sort of spreading the ideas of management out and covering a lot of topics?
Sure. So the genesis for the book is a management effectiveness training course that I offered to my clients. And as such, we covered a wide range of topics in the course. The course was 16 hours of training, 16 hours of PowerPoints. So one of my big challenges was how to take 16 hours of PowerPoints and make it conversational, the way I would in a training curriculum. You refer to the PowerPoints, but talk to the PowerPoints. And so in that process, I covered a great deal of ground because the people in my class were new managers and seasoned managers, but giving them all the opportunity to hear the same subject matter and the same language and get them all talking the same language around management.
That's interesting. How do you feel the medium for PowerPoint training works? How do you feel its effectiveness is? Because you can do that sort of training in person, which I feel related to some of the other points in your book, in person is such an important aspect to relationship building and trust building. Do you find that the same mechanism is as effective when you're delivering training remotely as you are in person?
There's never a substitute for in person. I think in person is the most effective form of communication. Now, having said that, the world has moved to a great deal of remote conversation. I think one-on-one, like you and I are talking now, is fairly effective. But what gets missed in a Zoom call or a Teams call is the opportunity for some casual encounter, some socializing, and unless we specifically make the time for it, it's lost. When you're in person, that casual conversation, what did you do over the weekend, or some commentary about what might be going on in society, you have that opportunity when you're in person. You lose that opportunity when you are remote. So I'm always advocating for meeting in person when you can. Now, in my coaching practice, I have clients all across the country, and I can't hop on a plane for each coaching session. Just not practical. So we try to make the most of this kind of interaction.
I see. How much does body language play into the aspects of not only your own coaching or your one-on-ones historically in your professional practice, both as an executive and also as a coach? And I ask this because I've noticed in this call that your camera orientation is different than our previous calls. I tend to gesticulate a lot. Like you'll see like hands fly up and then fly down a lot. How important is that sort of aspect of language in your practice and both as a coach and as a leader?
Sure. So, let's review the basic forms of communication. There's body language, there's tone of voice, and there's written communication. The most impactful is actually body language. So our ability to actually visually see somebody, and as you can see my hands now popping up in front, seeing that animation is incredibly impactful. But even just your facial expressions. So if you were to say to me, for example, Steve, how did you like working for that particular boss? And I go, okay, I just said volumes without saying a single word. Okay. Secondly is tone of voice. As people get more animated and emotional about what they're saying, it has a huge impact. That's why one of my favorite interview questions is, tell me about one of your most exciting projects, or tell me about your best job that you ever had. If I don't see that person starting to become more animated, see their voice elevate, then I know they're not being necessarily completely honest or maybe even somewhat disingenuous. Ironically, the least impactful form of communication are words, and yet in corporate America today, how do we communicate the most? Via email. Okay, via email, you don't get to see body language, you don't get to see tone of voice, although some might infer that capitalizing is a way of shouting in email, but so much is lost in email communication. So once again, Jeffrey, it presents the argument for meeting in person, communicating in person.
I definitely agree with you there. I work with a great many colleagues who I really, really like working with and who are very nice people, but you wouldn't be able to tell by reading their emails and their Slacks. They come off as a different type of person in written communication. I think to a degree, I am the same way. I'm very I'm a little bit drier. I'm a little bit more succinct in emails, and it could come off a bit different than my actual I have more of a bubbly, gregarious personality.
Right. Well, you can't beat the power and effectiveness of email for certain situations, right? You want to reach a large audience, you want to respond in the middle of the night or a different time zone, or things of that sort. I would say that when you are communicating something significant, impactful, emotional, perhaps a performance issue, or dissatisfaction as a manager with somebody's report or progress, email is not the vehicle to be using. At that point in time, the next option is a phone call, and more ideally where they have the opportunity to actually visibly see you and see your body language, see how you're communicating.
Yeah, I can see that in an ideal scenario. Working as I do in a completely remote company, we don't have any physical offices. Where I tend to make that breakdown is, we use Slack for sort of real time communication. I always say Slack is an instant messenger, not an instant response. Because as soon as you type something in Slack, someone expects a response right away, as if they've walked up next to you at your desk and tapped you on your shoulder. And that's not really the case. And then email is a great use of sort of a system of record, where exactly in your case, if you're highlighting a success or highlighting an area of opportunity or a failure, email is that system of record as well. So it becomes, I think, in my career over the last 20 some odd years, where before instant messaging started becoming more popular, email was the de facto method of communication. And now, at least in my company, which is again fully remote, so like many companies today, but also unlike many companies today, Slack is really sort of like the instant thing. And if you get an email, it tends to be something that requires a little bit more weight or gravitas, or is sort of like inter-company, right? Like we have other companies emailing us because they're not in our Slack. So it's sort of rarer that I get emails from people that I work with, because most of the time it's like a quick little message on Slack.
Sure.
I want to know, speaking of in person, one of the things you mentioned multiple times in the book, which I love, is lunch. I love it because it's like literal and it's meta, and it's also a good reference to the chicken soup of the soul. Lunch is the chicken soup of relationships. How do you create that feeling in a remote world?
Yeah, it takes some real extra effort. My criticism of remote interactions like Zoom or Teams is that people typically want to get off and on to the next item on their agenda, things that they need to deal with. And even under worse circumstances, when you have a lot of people on a Zoom call or a Teams call, people multitask, which is, of course, ineffective. So, back to your question, if you want to recreate that lunch experience, then you have to purposefully create the opportunity. There are a lot of vendors, for example, during the pandemic that would send out lunch or a wine kit, offering the opportunity to try to make it more social while you're at the same time on the call. So you have to make that extra effort. And that takes planning, it takes thought. It really does. The flip side is when you're meeting in person, you're a captive audience, so to speak, and that affords you the opportunity to explore other avenues other than the immediate subject matter of the meeting that was intended.
Yeah, absolutely true. I definitely agree with you there. It has been a challenge in the past to create those sorts of opportunities, not only when you're remote, and you're right about the multitasking. One joke I always make, and sort of not even a joke, is if you're on Teams or on a Zoom, for example, and you're doing something else, it's very easy to notice somebody doing this. You know what I mean? And they sort of just look off to the side very slightly while they're obviously typing or texting.
What I'd like to do at that point is say, Bueller?
Right.
Bueller?
Yeah, exactly.
See if I can get their attention.
Yeah, I find it's even more difficult when it's across time zones. The team that I manage, where I currently work, spans, including myself, really four different time zones, because I manage a few contractors in India. But we're all over the United States, East and West Coast, and we're in Europe. And it can be very difficult to find those opportunities. So you're absolutely right about that. How do you balance a desire for individual achievement with the necessity of collective achievement on a team?
Yeah, that's a big challenge. Sometimes it's cultural. because, and by that I mean, what does your company value and how do they evaluate you? If they, evaluate you and reward you based on your individual performance, then you're going to put self ahead of team potentially. Flip side of that, of course, will, influence behavior. If I reward a team and team results, then people will hopefully function more effectively as a team. I'm a big believer that, in the latter, that really high-performing teams are what makes companies successful. Now, there are individual contributors, I get that. We're not talking about them. We're talking about, and certainly in the book, we're talking about management, which means managing groups of people. And collective results are far more important than individual results. And the only way you change behaviors, well, I don't want to say the only way, I would say a way, is to incentivize that behavior. Then there's the examination of self, meaning how do you feel about yourself and your career, and how can you be the most successful in your role in a company? And in my opinion, being part of a group, being able to influence other people, those are critical success factors for a career. The person that works individually and remotely is less likely to be advancing their career as somebody who is working on a team and is visible and seen by management. Now, I don't know if you noticed, we're under attack by the sun in my office. I'm going to try to shift it a little bit, Jeff, to make it a little bit better.
Sure.
I'm not sure how you can handle that ultimately, but
no, it's perfect. It's perfectly fine.
Okay, I may have to keep shifting here.
No problem at all. It looks great. I know that the right side of your body is probably getting hotter as the afternoon progresses.
There's advantages and disadvantages to the sun.
Yeah.
Yes.
You mentioned a couple of interesting points. One is changing behavior, and this is sort of an interesting topic that I really enjoy discussing, which is the behavioral changes that need to occur when somebody transitions from an individual contributor on a team to a manager. And you touch upon this. Essentially, really, this is a current that runs through the entire book, because every competency you talk about in the book is really a competency that is applicable more to a manager of people than to an individual contributor. But I'm curious to know what mental shifts have to occur, and what mental shifts do you coach people through to transition from the IC role to a manager role? And the reason I ask is because one of my biggest pet peeves is when people become managers because they've been good at their IC role. And the two are very different. And so I'm curious to know, how do you help people through that transition?
Well, you've touched upon something that's incredibly critical. First of all, if you're familiar with the Peter Principle, people getting promoted to their highest level of incompetence.
Yeah.
Well, nobody should go into a management role without wanting to truly be a manager. And that does require some introspection from the point of view of understanding what's required to be a manager, to understanding that role, because you are now a person who is responsible and representing the company when you become a manager. When you're an individual contributor, you also represent the company, but not in the same way, and you are more focused on yourself. So you assume a certain level of responsibility becoming a manager within a company. And I think that's critical. Secondly, you must realize that you are now responsible and held accountable for the output and success of the team in its aggregate, and not just you as an individual. You as a manager cannot succeed while your people are failing. It's you either all succeed or you all fail. I mean, that's a very broad view, but one that I very much subscribe to. So as a manager, you have to think about, as you're moving from individual contributor to manager, how are you going to hold this entire team accountable? How are you going to motivate this team to be productive? How are you going to treat people equally? And as you have seen throughout the book, one of my basic management principles when you become a manager is treat people the way you would want to be treated yourself. Mm-hmm. Okay, and emulate those managers that you saw, that you admired, who were role models, versus the managers who you didn't care for, didn't like, and specifically things that they did or actions that they took that you found to be not to your liking or even repulsive. I often say that you have to work for a bad manager to really appreciate a good manager. Okay, and good managers have people who want to follow them as both their careers move up the career ladder. A successful leader will have people that want to follow them, and a bad manager will have people who can't wait to leave them. You know, Jeff, the number one reason that people change jobs is because of their manager. Mm-hmm. So as a manager, you need to make that investment in making sure your people want to be there, want to be productive, or fully engaged, and have an opportunity to grow.
Yeah, that's a great explanation. You know, I completely agree with you, and the research shows time and time and time again that people don't leave jobs, they leave managers. That's exactly the case. And I do believe that. And to your earlier point, I consider my management career very successful. The teams I've led have been very successful. Historically, I've had very low attrition on my teams. And I think that I've learned more about how to be a good manager from the bad managers that I've had, because I don't want to be like they were. So yeah, I think by the golden rule, treat others as you would want to be treated. I think that perfectly sums up, I think, my management style from a broad perspective. So I definitely agree there. And I think you also make a really good point. The way I've heard this articulated that I really like, that's very simple and succinct, is Andy Grove in his book High Output Management, which was the output of a manager is directly equal to the output of their team. And so I think that's a really nice, succinct way of saying it's the collective output, it's not your individual output when you become a manager. That can be a hard mindset to change when you're an individual contributor who is perhaps accustomed to receiving rewards or congratulations based on your individual results, and now you're sort of managing a team, and you have to be very cognizant of making that balancing act. So it's a difficult transition, and to your point, again, nobody should be a manager if they don't really want to be one. I think that's such an important point, because in my history, and both of our careers are tech in the background, I see that all the time, even to this very day, and I see it all the time, and I think it's a waste of a potential great manager, somebody who's moving into that position who doesn't want to be in that position. There's a position for a really good manager to be there, and then it's also a waste on the other side of a good individual contributor, because now you're moving someone out of that role who really wants to be in that role.
Sure, and you opened the door to to one of my favorite things to talk about. It's one of my pet peeves, is that managers don't spend enough time managing.
Right.
And and it goes to the question you raised earlier about moving from an individual contributor to a management role. It's so hard to let go of the things that you did well as an individual contributor and now rely upon other people to perform those tasks or similar tasks when you know you could do it better than them.
Yeah.
Letting go. Okay, so that's an important aspect of becoming a manager. and then spending time managing. To me it's fascinating because when I talk about, and I cover this in the book, when I talk about spending time managing and managing people and spending time with your people, some people immediately go into the camp of micromanaging.
Right.
Okay, and it's really interesting. If you ask most people, is micromanaging good or bad? They will say bad. Okay, and a micromanager is considered to be a bad manager. Well, here's an interesting thing to think about. Micromanaging, I like to think of that as a tool in your toolkit.
Absolutely.
When you have somebody who works for you who's not performing well, then you do need to micromanage them. And by that I mean spending time with them, helping them to develop the skills, helping them to understand where they're going wrong, helping them to get a clear understanding of what success would look like or what's to be expected from them in their job. And you use that as a tool. Now, if you came back and you told me that you're micromanaging everybody on your team, then either you've got the worst team in the world or you yourself have a real problem. But my point is that micromanaging is a tool, something that you should use to help overcome an issue, a deficiency. Now, when I say spending more time managing, I mean spending time with your people, understanding how they're doing, understanding where they're struggling, understanding where they need help and how you can provide that help to them, whether it be actually helping them to do the job or getting them training or whatever it happens to be. That all falls within the responsibility of being a manager.
Yeah, I totally agree with you there, and that's another really good point. And I've thought about this a lot. Is that in sort of quote unquote scrappy startups? Startups love to use that word scrappy. There is an idea of the player coach, right, or the manager who's also rolling up their sleeves with the team.
We call that a working manager, yeah.
The working manager, right. While I believe, like you say, context matters, right? In some cases, yes, you have to roll up your sleeves and dig in with some of the IC work. Totally understand, and I support that. I myself am a very engaged manager from that perspective. The trade-off is that you spend less time managing, and that managerial time is very, very, very important, and that is really your primary role. So I think it's a really interesting distinction that you make there. I think it's a really important point.
Just to comment on that, if you're a manager in where you are a working manager, you're only managing a couple of people, and therefore you have your own responsibilities, I would suggest that you get in your mind, this is the amount of time I want to be an individual contributor,
right?
And this is the amount of time I want to spend managing, and then introduce that discipline into your work schedule so that you're carving out time to be a manager and you're carving out time to be an individual contributor. And don't get caught up in I like doing the individual contributor work, that's what made me successful in the past. Get caught up in that and then overlook the fact that you're not providing management and guidance to the people who report to you.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point that really people should take away. If they take away anything from this conversation, that's one of the really important points. You mention a couple times in the book the phrase, always know the numbers with relation to budget. You say, always know the numbers, all the numbers. And I think that is a really important point, always know your numbers. To the same degree, being able to understand how to carve out the percentage of time between being a manager and being an IC is also really important. I had to do this exercise a couple years ago at my job when I came in with the expectation of being sort of a working manager. Same idea, which again, I joined startups because I enjoy that aspect of it. But over time, as my team was growing, as our spheres of responsibility were growing, I actually had to do that exercise and share with my boss, hey, if I'm spending X amount of time being an IC, for the sake of the math, I'm spending 30% of my time doing IC work, 70% of my time doing manager work. once you start to have those numbers, they become real, and you can start actually quantifying what work can and cannot be done, where things start to fall out, or where you have to deprioritize or reprioritize things. So I think that's such a really good exercise for anybody that's listening that is making the transition from IC to management, and the expectation is being a working manager, player coach type of thing. Really think about how much time you want to be spending doing both and need to be spending doing both, because you can start to quantify different aspects of your job doing that. I think that's a great point.
You touched on budgeting, Jeff, and budgeting is the one skill that an individual contributor typically doesn't get too involved with. I mean, as an individual contributor, you may have to put together a project plan and a project budget, but when you have a departmental budget, that's a whole new ballgame. And when you take on that role, it is your boss's responsibility to help train you, either to send you to a class or recommend a particular text, or just handhold you through the process of putting your first budget together. Budgeting, the financial aspect of management is often overlooked, but it's very significant. It's an important part of the job, and you don't spend that much time as an individual contributor, building those skills.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Let me ask you this question. So you mentioned, it's a skill that has to be developed. Your manager should send you to a class. What I've run into in my career many times are managers who are, I wouldn't say maybe disinterested, but maybe not aware of their team's developmental desires or opportunities for improvement. If somebody out there is listening has moved into a management role and is struggling with a competency that their manager has not commented on or hasn't sort of identified as an area for them, but they want to work on it themselves and they want the support, how do you suggest that they approach their manager? Say the desire is budgeting, right? You have a new manager, they want to be more familiar with it. Their manager is sort of, not sort of fostering, not tending to that developmental opportunity. How do you suggest that individual approach their manager about that?
Yeah, I would hope that individual has a relationship with their boss that they could just go in and say, hey, I'm not really good at this, or this is the first time I'm doing it, I need some help. What would be the best way for us to go about getting me that help? And maybe your boss, who might be too busy, will buddy you up with a more experienced manager. Maybe he will tap into the finance organization to have somebody work side by side with you to help you to understand the elements of budgeting, operational budgets versus capital budgets, the concept of depreciation and what that really means, and so on. Where you may not have had that more formal education that some people are able to get through, a college degree or through an MBA. So, but most importantly, there's a dual responsibility here in any kind of career development or personal, professional development. There's the individual's willingness to go ask for the help, develop the development as needed, and for the boss to recognize that that's their responsibility to help them to get that and to understand that developmental need exists. And so, one of the things I really encourage managers to do is to try to create that relationship with your boss where having that kind of conversation isn't hard. It doesn't have to be hard. And I think your manager would appreciate your coming in and asking for it rather than having you struggle or suffer with that. Now, having said that, we know in today's world, there's an incredible amount of resources available to you if you go out and seek them, whether it be on the internet, whether it be through a book, whether it be through, your own studies, going to school at night. I mean, there are lots of avenues available to you for skill development. If it's essential to your job, then your company does own some responsibility to ensure that you have that skill set and make that investment in you. If it's a deficiency that you feel you have, then it's your responsibility to go figure out how to go tackle that.
I think you're absolutely right. I agree wholeheartedly. How, shifting gears here to sort of a collective mission for a team, what is your process to develop the mission, vision, and values for a team? You make a great point in the book that I can't recall I've seen in many other books. Other books talk about the importance of a mission, vision at a company level, but importantly, I think, and as part of my practice, I create a mission and vision and a set of values. I call them tenets for my teams that I start, like independent but aligned with, but independent of the company's mission. What is your thought on that, and how do you approach that?
Sure. So let's first examine the term mission. Okay. So for a business, your mission defines what business you're in. Okay. So if you take that down to the departmental level, the mission of your department is how are you supporting the overall mission of the company? Why does your department exist? What role do you play in the operation of the company itself? So that's where you start out. Your mission defines the business that you're in, whether it's at the departmental level or at the company level. Okay, secondly, your vision is all about where do you want this department to go? What do you want this department to grow into or to become in terms of goods and services that you might be delivering in your role? And so again, clarity about each person, how they contribute in their own job to the overall mission of the company should be embodied in the vision that you establish for your department. And then finally, values. You set the tone. The company also sets the tone, by the way, in terms of what, how they want the company to run, what's important to them, how the company chooses to deal with simple things like conflict, job performance, and so on. But as a manager, you create a microcosm, okay? You decide how you're going to hold people accountable. You decide how you're going to assign work. You decide as the manager how you're going to evaluate your people and against what standards and what criteria. So that's your job as the manager. You need to sort through all of that. Now, if you're not sure, you ought to take your first pass at it and then review it with your boss. I'm afraid I'm turning into a ghost here, Jeff.
That sun is really doing some work on you over there.
I think I'm just trying to shift things around. This is a little bit better.
I can see it. No, I think you're exactly right. What do you feel about managers involving their teams in the creation of their values?
Well, I think that's okay, but remember the leader, meaning the manager, sets the tone for the group. Okay, and it's not always a democracy.
Right.
Okay, so in involving your team, I think it would be healthy to say, for a manager to say, these are the things that I value. Am I missing something, or is there something that you'd want to see that we hold up as a standard for our group that I've overlooked? Somebody might say, yeah, I value Fridays off. Okay, well, that's nice, but that may not fit into the ability to achieve our mission, nor be consistent with the company's, the way the company works. So I always say, I want your input, but I want you to understand it's not a democracy. Okay, at the end of the day, as the manager, I am held accountable and responsible for the mission that I've been given, the resources that I've been given, and the people that work for me. I'm accountable for that. Okay, and the company is spending money on me and all of you in order for us to fulfill our mission. So we have to be careful about, in my opinion, about how much we push down to our team in terms of, as I say, it's not always a democracy. Okay, now if we're voting about where we want to go to lunch, that's okay. That's a little bit different. But if we're going to talk about something that maybe comes in direct conflict with a corporate policy or practice, we have to be careful about that.
So, speaking of team involvement, in your book, you advocate for taking the time to hire the right people, but moving swiftly if they're not a fit. I'm trying to think. I think you said hire slow, cut quickly. That's the phrase. How do you balance compassion and perhaps like an improvement, performance improvement, with an underperforming employee with the team's overall welfare?
Sure. Well, okay, let's split that into the two issues that you talked about, hiring and firing. Okay, simply put. You can't do the work without the people. So hiring is a very important aspect. On the other hand, making a good hire is really important, because when you make a bad hire, then you're going to spend a lot of time at the back end in order to move that person out of the business or improve their performance and so on.
Yeah.
So on the hiring end, I'm all about investing a significant amount of time in making sure you hire the right people. One of my criticisms, Jeff, is that the typical process for a hire is you review their resume, you invite them in for an interview. If you like them, then you set up a second, and you spend an hour with them. And then you set up a second round of interviews, and if that goes well, then you'll maybe bring them back in for another half hour, an hour to see how those interviews went. If everything goes well, you do the reference checks, make a job offer. That's 2 hours. 2 hours for making a hire that you're now going to have to live with for God knows how long. So I'm all about spending more time with them. Go out to lunch with them, have them meet as many people as possible, but you have to be careful not to spend too much time, because they'll either lose interest or get another job offer, and then you'll be out of luck. So I'm about spending more time at the front end to make sure you make a good hire. I absolutely believe you ought to do the reference checks yourself and not rely on a headhunter who has a financial interest in the process, or somebody in HR who may not fully understand what you're looking for in the job. You should do the reference checks yourself. Okay, on the back end, I'm all about talking directly, succinctly, and clearly about a performance issue. So if I have an issue with you, I'm going to want to make sure that you understand clearly what's expected. And I'm going to make sure about that, because I'm going to have a conversation with you. We're going to be very clear about what you need to do to improve. And my expectation is that you're going to change immediately, that you get it. And if you're not getting it and you're not improving, then I'm all about cut your losses as soon as possible. I have seen where managers have allowed this to drag on, and then finally, when the decision is made one way or the other, people will come back to that manager and say, "What took you so long?
Right.
Or why did you act more decisively, more quickly?" So if somebody's feeling out there that, well, maybe we're being too quick about this, I'm saying, and I mean this sincerely, I'm going to have a clear conversation with you, and my expectation is you're going to change immediately. You're going to get it. Okay, if you need help, you're going to come to me. I'm going to leave that door open for me to be helpful to you. But let me give you a simple example. Okay, somebody comes to work late all the time. Okay, and we're talking about an in-office situation, which doesn't apply to your situation, of course, but where somebody's coming late all the time. Okay, they're coming in late consistently. So I put them on a performance improvement plan where I say you can have no more than one occurrence of lateness in the next 30 days or no occurrences of lateness in the next 30 days, and you don't pay any attention to that. Okay? Well, to me, big red flag.
Yeah.
You're not going to be there very long because you're not making an effort. Now, I'll recognize and I will have some empathy about something could happen. It could be an accident on the freeway or somebody gets sick or what have you. But, there's only so many times that you can attend, the same grandmother's funeral or whatever it happens to be before I say enough.
Yeah.
Okay? Now, in terms of the impact on the team, poor performers drag a team down. I mean, this is, to me, really clear. And you need to deal with problem performers decisively and quickly. My expression is cut your losses early.
Yeah.
Okay? And that's why, because that's so painful, I mean, most companies have a process for getting rid of somebody who is a non-performer. Typically, it's a verbal warning, then a written warning in the form of a performance improvement plan. Mm-hmm. Even in some companies, it's a final written warning, okay, and then they're out the door. Well, that takes a lot of time. That's a huge detractor from you, in terms of your time that's available, but you could be doing other things. So it's far better to spend more time at the front end and make sure you make a really good hire. But again, you can't do the work without the people, so you have to balance that out. Here's something that I did when I was in my first career. Mm-hmm. We would have a critical job open for 6 months. We couldn't find the skill. Okay? I said, enough. Go out and hire the smartest kid you can find out of school and train them. Mm-hmm. Okay? Smart kids out of school, within 6 weeks, they are sometimes more productive than people that have been around for 2 years. So, that's just a practice that I ultimately employed was, go hire smart people and train them.
Yeah. I have been complimented on my hiring strategy in the past, which I'm very grateful for, because I have always said that I hire double A candidates. I hire candidates for aptitude and attitude. And I totally agree with the hire the smartest person. There are a couple of tenets that I usually follow. Like, for example, one, hire for the right attitude, right? So no brilliant jerks can ever come onto my team. You can be the smartest person in the world, but if you're not a pleasure to work with, if you're not a team player, if you will not help the person next to you when they are in trouble, if you're not a knowledge sharer, the good qualities go on and on. I don't care if you just won the Nobel Prize, you're not coming onto the team. The other aspect is the aptitude. So if you have the attitude down, I have hired people onto my team that have quite a considerable gap between the desired skill set and actual skill set. But that's okay, because if they have the aptitude to learn and employ the skills on the job, and they have the right attitude that sort of never give up, they have that growth mindset, use whatever words you want, they will be successful. And I have seen that time and again. And so I totally agree that putting the time in at the beginning is really crucial. The flip side that I've also discovered, in addition to my agreement with you that a weaker person or an underperforming person, to say it properly, drags the team down, they are an anchor for the rest of the team, is that if you let that go on too long, then the perception of your leadership starts to change and you become a less effective leader. And so it is difficult to make those decisive actions, but they are definitely necessary in a leadership role. I think that's one thing that a lot of ICs don't realize when they transition into leadership, is that as a leader, you are going to have to make decisions that many people are not going to like. And that's just part of the dirty work of leadership. You just have to do it as part of your job. And terminations are one of those things. So I definitely concur.
So, yeah, so I agree with everything you said. I love at the hiring end. I love your double A approach. I look for, which is another way of saying what you said. I look
Yep.
for work ethic, which I think is really important. I look for gratitude. Okay, people who think that a job is an entitlement, I don't think understand how things work in the corporate world. Okay, I think you should be grateful to have a job. I think you should be grateful to have the opportunity to earn a living and support your family and to grow and to assume more responsibilities and to learn while you're growing. And you should have gratitude for a company providing that environment for you to enable you to grow in your career. I'm big on that. I really am.
Yeah. I also really like. I've heard another manager. I had another manager at another job who was fantastic. I actually worked with him at two different jobs. To your point about people following good leaders earlier, I'm going to take a small tangent here. And I have done that twice in my career, actually. I used to work at Netflix, and I left Netflix to join Snapchat. And the reason I left is because there was a manager at Snapchat who I ended up working for, who I had worked for, who I'd worked with. He was a manager of another team. I worked alongside him way back in the day when we worked together at Twitter, the company formerly known as Twitter, and he was at Snap, and I left Netflix to go work for him at Snap. Netflix was a good gig. Don't get me wrong. It was a hard decision to leave. And then the immediate job after that, which was where I am now, there was a former colleague of mine at Snapchat who I also worked alongside, who became a VP where I am now. And he was the one that put me up for the job where I am now. So he was my recommendation in, and I left Snapchat to go work for him. So I completely agree. People follow good leadership. The other thing I wanted to comment on was your comment about you saying I expect those changes to happen right now, right? I think that's spot on. And the reason I mentioned the Snapchat thing and following good leaders is at a twofold reason. One was to share, people follow good leaders. I'm an exact example of that. The other is that leader at Snapchat said what you said in a phrase that I really like, which is, and I think he got it from a book, and I don't know which book it is, but anyway, I'm going to attribute it to him, is be patient with results, not with behaviors. So the behaviors need to change right away, right? If you're coming in late, if you're not exhibiting a corporate value that is expected, a team value or tenet that is expected, I expect that behavior to change immediately. The results of that behavior changing, okay, I can have a little bit of patience there because the results may take time, but the immediate behavioral change has to happen, and that is my expectation. So definitely, it's nice to have this validation. Like, thank you for sharing these insights.
Sure.
You talk about, let's talk about actually continuing this thread, managers being committed to success. I have a question for you, which is in your book toward the end, you talk about Heckler's law, which is the person who hires you is committed to your success. The person who inherits you owes you nothing. And I understand that from a sort of higher level perspective, where I'm curious to know your thoughts are, how do managers proactively sustain trust and provide support during leadership transition? So someone inherits you, for example, but it's as a result of a reorg or another internal structural change, because now they're not like coming in and taking over a brand new team. You're potentially moving into an organization where you have proven yourself as a potentially high performer at the company. The manager may not know you, but there's some level of understanding and sort of shared value and culture by way of being employed at the company together. Does that change your opinion about where Heckler's law can be employed?
So, the first part, the person who hires you is committed to your success may be self-evident, but let me just make a couple of comments about it. The person who hires you wants to demonstrate to the world that they made a great hire, so they are committed to your success. And I'll give you a quick example. When I was when I became the CIO at Sony Pictures, I went through 14 interviews. People say to me, "Oh my God, Steve, that had to be horrible." I said, "No, it's the best thing that ever happened to me." Why? Because when I started, those 14 people who interviewed me were committed to my success when they gave me a thumbs up. They wanted to see me succeed. Everybody else was standing on the sidelines saying, let's see what he can do. Okay, when you get a new boss, it's a reset. That's essentially what I mean. It's a reset. So, to your question, how do you establish that trust right away? The best thing that you could possibly do is sit down with your new boss and have an open dialogue about how he or she wants to work, how they want to work with you, how they want to communicate with you, what their expectations are from you. So, for example, if there's a problem, do you want me to text you? Do you want me to email you? Do you want me to phone you? What happens if it happens in the middle of the night? Do you want me to wake you up? I mean, so on and so forth. What kinds of information do you want me to share with you? What kinds of information do you not want me to share with you? And I would especially establish the understanding that if at any point in time my new boss is not happy with me or any member of my team or with our performance, that he not wait, he not sit on that information, but he bring it to me immediately and give me the opportunity to course correct, to fix, to address, to cajole, to create, address the disinformation, misinformation, whatever is going on. The worst thing that could happen is that your new boss just sits there and collects all this information like collecting postage stamps and eventually either, throws it all out at one time down the road. I want that understanding. So, for example, if I've been rated as a high performer, let's say a 1 being an outstanding performer, and I get a new boss, I'm going to go in and I'm going to say, listen, I've been rated a 1 for my last appraisal, my last 2, my last 3 performance reviews. If you see me deviating in any way from being outstanding, I want you to tell me. I want to know because I want to fix that. Because you may not, you may put the bar up here, which might be a little higher than where it was with my previous boss. I get that. Every new boss is new. Every new boss sets a new set of standards, a new set of guardrails, a new set of what have you. I need to know that. I want us to communicate with each other. Okay? And that's my job. So that's the most important thing in the beginning. And remember, it's up to you as the manager to get the work done, to be successful in delivering on the mission of your department. So you don't want to ask on a daily basis, but you certainly want to ask, periodically with the level of satisfaction. Remember, it's your boss decides your fate. Let's be really clear about this. Your boss decides your fate. They decide whether you get promoted, you don't get promoted, how big a raise in most cases or not, a bonus, and so on. So you want to have the best possible relationship with your boss that you possibly can. Okay, well, the best possible thing you could do for him is do your job and do it really well, because you do a good job, you're going to make him look good or her look good. So this is really important. So being clear on what success looks like, very, very important. When you start a new job, okay, with a new boss, have that conversation. What does success look like? Well, how do you frame that conversation? Imagine it's a year from now. What do you, my boss, want to see me have accomplished with my department, with the resources that the company has given me that I am to be responsible and accountable for? What do you want to see happen? Okay, so that's really, really important. Let me give you, slight divergence, but I think very, very relevant in this conversation. I'm going a little bit beyond the new manager idea, but in performance reviews, okay? Performance reviews are based on goals, correct? You agree, Jeff? Of course.
I agree. Yeah.
Okay. So let's say you have a goal that says, I'm going to deliver Project X in 12 months at a cost of $1 million. Okay, that's my goal. Now, if I do that, is that meets requirements or is that outstanding? Was that goal a stretch goal? We don't have those conversations. We set the goal up and then we put the spin on the evaluation at the end based upon, as the manager, what we think. I want that clarity. I think that's really important. And I really encourage the folks out there that are listening, when you set your goals, be really clear about whether that meets the requirements of the job or whether that's a stretch goal. And if so, and I accomplish that, that's outstanding. If it meets the requirements of the job, then you can start to ask questions like, okay, what if I brought the 12 months into 11 months? Right. What if I did the $1 million is $900,000? How does that affect my overall performance rating? And so on. I mean, you want to have that clarity about how you're going to be evaluated so that you don't get to the end and be disappointed. Okay? Just, to me, it's pretty simple. But we don't do that.
We don't do that enough. You're right. I think it's because, at least in my experience, there is always sort of this uncertainty, and we don't have to rabbit hole into this. I talk a lot in my own content about developing psychologically safe environments where people can feel comfortable asking these types of questions outright. But to your earlier point, when you say your boss decides your fate, that's a very scary notion for people, especially if they haven't had good experiences with former bosses,
Then they understand exactly what I'm saying.
Yeah, right. You're right. It makes it even more important to understand with perfect clarity what the expectations are. To that point, one interesting thing in your book, you do talk about seeking that clarity, right? There are sections in there throughout the book, at least in one particular section, where you talk about making sure you clearly understand the success criteria.
Right.
What is not mentioned in the book that I think you touched upon here is the concept of potentially managing up, right? Like if you're not getting that from your boss, how do you get that from your boss, right?
So a couple of things I mentioned in the book. Here's one example. If you go into your boss and you say, how am I doing? Okay, now, by the way, you don't do that every day. Okay, you'll drive him crazy or her crazy, so you don't want to do that. Okay, but periodically you want to go in and you say, how am I doing? And your boss says, you're doing a good job, or you're doing a great job. You say, well, that's good. Ego fulfilling, but you got very little information, right? So then what I encourage people to do, you may recall this in the book, Jeff, is, okay, asking your boss, on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate my overall performance? Now, if your boss says a 9 or a 10, I would take that and head for the bar, okay? You got the answer you want, that's great. If your boss says 7 or an 8, then the question is, okay, that's really useful. What do I need to do to be a 10? And you hold your boss to giving you an answer.
Right.
What you would have to do to be a 10. If your boss says nobody gets a 10, then, to me, that tells me a lot about that boss's character. Okay? I'll come back to that in a moment if you like. But the whole idea is 7 or 8, tell me what I have to do. If he says, I think you're about a 6, okay, my first question would be, is this fixable? Is it repairable? Because a 6 means you're failing, okay, or less. You're failing, okay? So I need to know where I stand at that point. Is it fixable? If he says, I don't think so, then I would say, well, then let's talk about a separation. Let's talk about how I leave the company and how much severance package I can get. Because I have a boss that has no confidence in me and my ability to fix what he thinks is a performance issue.
It could be a mutually advantageous separation, because I would not appreciate having a boss that didn't let me know that I wasn't performing, and I have to find out about it when I ask him about my rating scale.
Right. Well, I mean, that's why if we go back to the what does success look like, in the book I suggest the following, that you want to go to your boss and as early as possible and say, what are the top 3 things? Just like I was talking about a moment ago about framing it in 12 months. What are the top 3 things that you want to see me accomplish over the next 12 months, such that you would tell me I hit it out of the park?
Right.
Okay? Now, you're going to get one of 3 answers. Okay? He's going to either rattle off 3 things, or he's going to say, good question, let me think about it.
Right.
Or he's going to say to you, well, what do you think they are?
Right.
So you got to go into that meeting with 3 things in your hip pocket. Okay? Yeah. If the answer is, what do you, good question, let me think about it, then you don't let him off the hook. You say, great, I'll come back our next one-on-one and maybe we can talk some more about it. Okay, but if he rattles off 3 things and they're 3 different things than you had in your hip pocket, you have just been given a gift. Mm-hmm. Okay, because now you have the opportunity to course correct. But even more importantly, you want to examine your thinking that led to your 3 things, and you want to understand from him what was his thinking on identifying those 3 things. And you can put out your 3 things if you like and say, well, I thought these were really important, but don't go into sell mode on those. Hold back. Really try to understand your boss's thinking. Remember, everybody sees things through a different lens. And this whole concept of alignment is all about that you see things the same way. Mm-hmm. Okay, when you don't see things the same way, how did each party get to that conclusion? Mm-hmm. Okay, your boss is under a whole different set of constraints and pressures that could be very different from the ones that you're under. If you can understand that, it helps you to position yourself and the actions that you take as a manager.
Yeah, I also think it's important from the aspect of understanding your boss's thinking, because that's also enlightening in and of itself. Your boss is viewing things from a different organizational perspective. Like I mentioned Andy Grove before, and another thing he mentions in high output management, I have read it more than once, is the more you ascend, the higher you ascend in leadership, the more obsolete you become. And what he meant by that in the context of how he was writing it was, as an IC, you are highly technically competent in whatever it is that you do, right? Whether you're a line worker in a factory, whether you're a software engineer, whether you're whatever else you're doing, when you're an IC, you are deep in that at a technical level. Then you ascend one level to, first level manager, and you become a little bit less technically proficient. You might still be highly technically proficient, knowing sort of what it is that you did before, but now if you're managing a team of people and that team is doing 4 different things, you have immediately become less technically proficient because you cannot do all of those things. And then the next level you ascend, you become even more technically obsolete, right? Because now you're managing first line managers, and you basically have your hands out of any technical work at all. And the higher and higher it goes. And so it's been an interesting experience for me as I have ascended the level myself from IC to director, where I'm no longer the technical expert on my team, and I haven't been for some time, right? I have technical experts underneath me, but what I always find fascinating is when I speak to my boss, who's the CFO, exactly what you mentioned. I love listening to why he thinks things are priorities, because he is approaching things from a completely different perspective than I am. And I find that to be very interesting and enlightening in terms of how the company is working and sort of like what magical things happen behind the curtain at that level. That's always, I always like want to know what's going on at the level above me. What do they know that I don't know yet? It's a common question you hear from ICs or even from like managers of directors is like, why didn't I know about those things earlier? When are they getting aware? I like sort of like peeking behind the curtain. So it's always a very enlightening experience for me to hear how my own boss is thinking about things. And that's why on my own teams, I find it critical to have constant open dialogue and create the type of environment where people are unafraid to ask the questions. Like, well, how did you get to that? If I'm saying, if I have a harebrained scheme that I want to do on my team, I want my team to be like, why would you even think of that? Instead of, yeah, let's do that. Because it might be, I'm just approaching it from one aspect. I might be missing a whole other thing that because they are viewing things from a different perspective also. So, yeah, I find that perspective taking very, very, a very interesting aspect of interpersonal work, Just me. Let me ask you, what are one or two everyday practices managers can adopt to keep their antenna up for their team's well-being?
So, being in constant communication with your people is important. And establishing a trusting environment where people are not afraid to give you bad news. They're not afraid to tell you when they're struggling and need help. And it's not an admission of failure, but rather recognizing in the best interest of the company that this problem needs to be addressed, that you're maybe in over your head or just needing some help, some assistance, and not being afraid to ask for it. So creating that level of trust on your team where not just your boss, but your peers, and not just your peers, but your subordinates, and not just your subordinates, but your constituents, your stakeholders, the people you work with, that people are not afraid to tell you there's a problem that needs to be addressed, then I think that's how you avoid getting into real trouble, getting into a problem situation. Now, how do you do that? You have to pave the way for it. You have to spend time. I'm becoming a ghost again. Let me see. This might be better. Here we go.
I think that's yeah.
Building relationships. And in those relationship building opportunities, lunch being the chicken soup of relationships where you can, but building relationships and setting the tone, setting the stage. Jeff, we work together. If you hear something about my group that I need to know about, let me know. Don't sit on it. And I'll do the same for you. If you need something from me, let me know, and vice versa. So we have to build this kind of a trust where we can interact with each other in a way that it's no holds barred. We literally want to be successful so that, we're, as managers, we get paid to problem solve. So how do we solve those problems? Well, we bring the right resources to bear. And, I always say I can't solve a problem if I don't know about it. So I got to know about it. So you got to encourage people to have that open channel, that open dialogue. That's the most effective way, Jeff, to handle that.
What advice would you give a first-time manager looking to establish a credible leadership brand inside and outside their organization?
Well, if you're new in any role, okay, in any role, you should, unless you have to deal with what I call a burning fire, okay, and for our audience, I hope everybody knows what that means. It means that there's some emergency, something urgent that needs to be addressed. In any new role, you should spend the first 90 days just talking to people and listening, okay? The work of your department is most likely going to get done without you because the individual contributors, the workers, are doing the work, and they know what their jobs are. And you're there, and you should avoid making any rash decisions without making sure you're gathering a lot of information about the environment, the lay of the land, the culture of the company, the culture of the organization, the way things get done, the politics. We shouldn't deny politics exists in every organization. You need to understand them. So my counsel is don't do a lot. Do a lot of listening. Do a lot of talking to people and start to formulate your plan. When things start to become clear to you about what you want to do, any changes you want to make, or how things are going, or whatever, then you go into your boss and you have that conversation. Here's, I've been on the job 90 days. Here's what I'm observing. Here's what I'm thinking. Socialize that idea with your boss, okay? Socialize your ideas with your boss. You can also do that with your peers, okay? To the extent that you build relationships with them, here's what I'm observing. What do you think? You've been here longer than I've been here. How do you think people would react if I made this change? So on and so forth. So in the beginning, spend the time listening. Don't feel that you have to make decisions right away. Unless it's a burning fire.
Do you feel like that suggestion, the 90-day suggestion, is more relevant at a particular level of leadership? Because I can see it being very relevant if you're coming in as like a director or a C-level exec at a larger corporation, right? It's a big moving machine. You don't want to pull out a linchpin and then, the thing starts to collapse. But at a smaller organization or for a first level manager, do you feel like the 90 days still applies? Because at a smaller organization or for a first time manager, I would think that, particularly if I guess it could also be the case, context is key here, of course. If it's an internal hire or an external hire, one will have a larger ramp up period than another. But do you feel like that 90 days is more relevant at a particular level of leadership, or do you counsel it sort of across the board to everybody?
Well, that's where I would like to start, but it's all contextual, for sure. But if you're hearing this and you say, that doesn't sound like it can work for me, okay, and I'll say, okay, fine. But then I would go into your boss. I'm new. I'm just starting. What are you expecting to see from me in the first 30, 60, 90 days?
Sure.
Let's talk about that.
Yeah.
Let's get aligned. Let's have agreement. My expectation is if their thinking is somewhat aligned with my thinking, they're going to say, go around, talk to everybody, understand what everybody's doing, understand their roles, how it all fits together like a jigsaw puzzle, understand who's happy, understand who's not happy, understand where the issues are, come back and talk to me about it.
Yeah.
That's what I would hope your manager would say to you as a new manager.
Yeah, make those relationships, right? Like that's always a function of first I wouldn't even say 30 days. I would say first 2 weeks on the job is
Sure.
I'm going around to all my
And
counterparts.
Jeff, that's why I was saying, like when I interviewed with those 14 people at Sony, once I started, I had an open door to them. They knew who I was. It wasn't like, hello, I'm new guy. It's hello, I'm Steve. We met before.
Right.
We spent some
So,
time together. We talked about the issues.
so I haven't cracked the double digits in terms of my interviews. I think my most rigorous technical interview was probably in the like years and years ago. It was probably around 2007. I interviewed at Google. I was a finalist for one of their technical roles. They flew me up to Mountain View, and I had a day's worth of interviews from morning until the end of the day with a
Right.
1 hour break for lunch. It was at least 7 people. And I don't think I've had that many interviews since then. It's maybe 5 or 6 is sort of where it peters out. How many of those 14 people do you think you had to get a thumbs up from in order to get that job? Did it have to be unanimous, or was it like a quorum? How do you think that went?
I have no idea. I have no idea. But let's go at it from the other side, which is if you're going to ask people to interview, then you need to get their input. And if somebody is absolutely opposed to the candidacy, you really have to understand why. Okay? I think it's a very useful exercise. I don't believe they did that at Sony, but I think it's a useful exercise to bring the people together who we interviewed and have them all talk about the candidate. What did you like? What didn't you like? Any red flags? Because you may see something that I missed, or there might be something in that person's background or the way they answered a particular question that you asked that I never asked, and so on. So if you're going to have people interview, you've got to take their input, and if at the end of the day you want to go forward with this person, anybody who was against hiring that person, you need to smooth the waters, or they're just going to be saboteurs to that person's success. So you need to smooth the waters, and you need to really have the conversation about, well, look, if I hire them, you're going to be able to work with them? And if they say, absolutely not, you're setting up your new hire for failure. I realize what I'm describing is somewhat extreme, but I'm trying to make a point here, which is,
Yeah.
if you're going to involve other people in the process, you got to listen to what they have to say.
Yeah,
Okay?
I totally agree, and I do. Yeah, I would hope that after a 30-minute or 1 hour interview, nobody comes away with I could never work with this person. But to your point, I think that bringing people together, and I've seen this done many different ways at the different companies I've been a part of, but it's good to know for managers, because this is not covered in the book, but any new manager is going to have to be involved in the interview process for hiring people onto their team, and part of that process at most places, can't say all, but most places, is going to be that regrouping of all of the interviewers, whether it's before or after they deliver. The way that we do it and the way that I've done it in my last couple jobs is you interview a candidate, you give your feedback based on a number of different criteria independently of anybody else. So you do that before you talk to anybody else. Then you all get together and you share your rating and your criteria, whatever, so that your initial feedback is not tainted by the experience of others. And then
Yeah.
you have the thing. And then it's an opportunity for other people to negotiate. Well, what about this? And, change people's opinions.
So let's approach it from the other side. Okay, let's talk about you, Jeff, interviewing for another opportunity. And you go through the process that I described earlier. You spend an hour with your new potential boss. You spend a whole day, like at Google, interviewing with a whole bunch of other people. Hopefully some of the people that might report to you, but certainly your peers and other people you're going to have to work with.
Great point.
Then you at the end of the day, you spend, half an hour with the potential boss again, debriefing.
Yeah.
Do you have enough information to make, to accept that job if they made you a job offer? Okay?
Yeah.
So my point is, if they're interested in you, then you have the opportunity to say, I'd like to spend some more time with you.
Yeah.
I'd like to maybe meet some of the people that are going to report to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
In other words, if they're interested in you, then you have an opportunity to drive the process to your satisfaction. Okay, now they may not want to wait, they may want to move fast, so on and so forth, but you can indicate this is really critical to my decision process.
Absolutely.
I've only spent 2 hours with you. I have to, I'm going to be here for years.
Yeah.
I need to know if this is the right situation for me. I need to learn more about you. I need to learn more about the company. I want to spend more time with my most critical customer.
Yeah.
I want to try to get to know some of the people on my team who are critical to my success. Those are reasonable, in my opinion, reasonable asks. They may not be viewed that way on the other end, but my point is, this is something that you should really take into consideration.
I definitely agree with you. I think as you pursue an opportunity and you close in on the offer or even receive the offer, depending on sort of what position that is, I always advocate to people who are seeking my advice. And I've done a number of mock interviews with a number of my friends and former colleagues that have helped them get roles at my former jobs because I have been either a hiring manager or have had experience going through the process. And I always advocate that don't squander the opportunity to interview them as much as they are interviewing you. Obviously, within good judgment and instinct, this is not the Inquisition. You don't have to grill them, but it is your opportunity to find out whether or not it's the right place for you. Because if you get the job, and I know people at jobs that they look great on LinkedIn to have the little logo next to your name, but they are unhappy at those jobs. Is that trade-off worth it? And to a degree, it's a leap of faith, right? Like, you don't know all of the nuances of a company before you join it. Part of it is a leap of faith. And it is not reasonable to try to ascertain every single aspect of that company while you're in the interview phase, particularly from a macro perspective. Like, look at where we are now in tech. People don't have their pick of the litter anymore. It's hard to get a job in tech today with I call it a tech Armageddon over the last couple of years, where there have been hundreds of thousands of layoffs from a handful of companies. But it still is an important experience for an individual to do as much as they can to interview the interviewer to see whether or not it's the right place for them to land.
Yeah.
No.
I understand. Listen, if you have somebody that's been out of work for a long time, they're going to be less selective, let's say, than somebody else who already has a job and is looking to move on.
Yeah.
But I would still argue, maybe not successfully, but I would still argue that you don't want to go into a job and then at the end of week 1 or week 2, you're saying, oh my God, I made a horrible mistake.
Yeah.
Okay. And so, again, on both sides of the table, the more time you spend at the front end, the happier you're going to be later on.
Yeah. Well, Steve, I want to say thank you for your time. We've run almost an hour and a half here, and that was the upper limit, and I want to be respectful of your evening. It looks like the sun is also being respectful of your evening, so that's nice. I want to ask before we hang up on each other, do you have any upcoming projects? Is there anything you'd like to share with the audience before we adjourn today?
Well, writing my book, so ... You Want to Be a Manager, was a labor of love. I tried to reflect a lot of myself in the vignettes, which I know from our conversations you really appreciated. Mm-hmm. I've been fortunate enough to have 2 careers. My first career in IT and my second career as an executive coach. So what I have coming up next is I wrote another book called So, dot, 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 You Want to Be an Executive Coach. And it's almost ready to go to the publisher. And I have a third book that I'm about 50% done with, called So, dot, 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 You Want to Be a CIO. And in all of these books, what I'm trying to do with the reader is to share some of my wisdom, some of my experience, having been there, done that, so that people don't make the same mistakes that I made, so that people are more aware. For example, we didn't even get into it, but I mentioned the word politics. There are politics in every company. Some people choose to ignore them. Other people choose to understand them so they can navigate themselves more effectively through the organization. I mean, these are nuances. They're things that you pick up along the way. And so I'm at the point in my life about giving something back, and I'm doing it through my coaching, and I'm doing it through these books.
Well, I'm very excited to get the next books when they're released, so I hope you will let me know, because I will be the first to read them and buy them. And then if we ever meet up in person, because we are in the same area,
Right.
then I will bring a book with me, because I like to have autographed copies on my bookshelf.
I'd be most happy to sign. It's fine.
Well, Steve, thank you so very much for your time. Really appreciate it. It was a real pleasure talking to you, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.
Okay. Thanks, Jeff. Take care.